everyone. Welcome back to Din and Daf. This week we are talking about Lifnei Iver Lo Titein Michshol, not putting a stumbling block before the blind, specifically the way that it shows up in the first parak of Avodah Zarah. The way it shows up in the first parak of Avodah Zarah is not helping somebody else sin. In this case, not aiding a pagan, making it possible or much easier for the pagan to worship Avodah Zarah. Of course, it applies to what we do to Jews as well, making it easier or possible for a fellow Jew to violate halacha. There is another explanation of what Lifnei Iver Lo Titein Michshol means, and that is giving bad advice to someone on purpose. But we're going to leave that for another time because that's not how it's showing up in the first paragraph of Avodah Zarah. And I want to think about the logic behind it. Generally speaking, we're offered three logics by different commentaries throughout the ages. One is this is a sin ben adam l'chavero. This is something of a damage that you're doing to a fellow person, and you're not allowed to do it by causing them to sin, by making them closer to the sin. What you've done is you've done nezek to them, you've damaged them. Another explanation is this is ben adam l'makom. You have caused somebody to violate a tzivui, Ratzon Hashem, and therefore you are culpable because you've violated something, Ben Adam Lamakom, excuse me. And a third is that you actually have both tracks within the Avera. Sometimes it's working off of the Ben Adam L'Chavero track, sometimes it's working off of the Ben Adam Lamakom track. I also want to remind us, even though I'm really coming off of Dapim Yud Dalet and Ted Vav in Avodah Zarah, that back on Daf Vav, we saw a very important distinction in terms of Lifnei Iver Lo Titein Michshol, and that was whether a person is considered klape vis-a-vis that avera, that transgression, to be ki'ilu on the same side of the nahar, right? It's chad ivra denara. Are they on the same side of same bank of the river as the sin, meaning they're going to get there with or without you. So you didn't really make it that much easier or more plausible that they would sin, even by maybe giving them something that they could use to sin. Or is it tre ivre denare, or denara, excuse me? Or is it like they were on two different banks of the river and basically they were on one bank, the sin was on another, and basically what you did is instead of making them cross over the river to get it, you made it much more plausible and maybe even possible to begin with for them to do the Avera. So that's an important just limitation that we have to remember. But I'm kind of interested in the weird cases. Like, are there exceptions to the rule of Lifnei Iver Lo Titein Michshol? Because I would imagine that as modern people, we often interact with people who do not keep halacha at all, or do not keep halacha the way that we do. And the possibility of getting into a Lifnei Iver Lo Titein Michshol situation is quite plausible. So I want to see sort of examples of that. We'll look at two kinds of examples. One is a Mipnei Darchei Shalom example, where actually, in order to keep the peace, Lifnei Iver may actually be necessary to be transgressed, or maybe it just doesn't apply. And another is what's called Lifnei de Lifnei, right? A situation where I didn't directly influence you to do an Avera, but I am maybe giving you something that you then will give to somebody else who's going to do that Avera, right? So it's all about interactions with other people. So let's jump in. So first things first, I want us to note that in the Gemara on Ted Vav Amud Aleph to Ted Vav Amud Bet in Avodah Zarah, we have this case where Rav Huna sells a cow to a Gentile. And people are surprised, right? How could he do such a thing? Amar le Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda said, my taima avid marhachi, why did he do this thing? And remember, the context was about whether that cow would do work on Shabbat. Amar le emor l'shchita zavna. He says, well, I could just say that he actually bought it to slaughter it and eat it, not to use it for labor at all. And so the Gemara says, how do we know that we even do such a thing? How do we know that we even sometimes say Lifnei Iver doesn't apply because we can talinan, right? We can basically hang our hats on the possibility that the other person who's buying the thing is actually not going to use it for a transgressive purpose, but is actually going to use it for a completely mutter purpose. So where do we get that from? And the Gemara quotes a Mishnah that, by the way, shows up both in Masechet Shvi'it and again, at least part of it, in Masechet Gittin. So here's the Mishnah. Ditnan Beit Shammai omrim lo yimkor adam para hachoreshet b'shvit. So Beit Shammai thinks you should not be able to sell a fellow Jew a cow that plows on the Shemitah year. Why? Lifnei iver lo titein mechshol. You don't want that animal to go be doing work. You don't want a person to work that animal on Shvi'it to plow, which they're not allowed to do. Beit Hill matirin, but Beit Hill say it's okay. Why? Because again, this kind of talinan, we can hang our hats on the concept or the possibility that the person who is buying it actually is just going to shech the animal and eat it and is not going to use it for plowing, right? So here the Gemara says something very important, that lifnei iver lo titein machshol might not be such an issue when there's a possibility of them doing something kosher with it. But actually, if you go down the rabbit hole of that Mishnah that's been quoted and you look at how it's quoted in full in the Mishnah in Shvi'it, you find something quite interesting. So certainly we'll start with number 2, Mishnah Shvi'it, Perek Hey, Mishnayot Chet and Tet. So we have what we just quoted. Beit Shammai omrim lo yimkor lo para choreshet b'shvit, uBeit Hillel matirin mipnei shu yachol shachta. Right, so Beit Shammai doesn't want you selling the para in the Shemitah year if it can plow, because he's not interested in the talinan understanding of maybe they'll just shecht it and eat it. He's worried that they're actually going to use it to plow. Whereas Beit Hillel say, no problem, talinan, there's no lifnei either. We think that maybe the person might shecht it. But then the next Mishnah, or back to back, says Mashelet Isha lechaverta achashuda ala shviit napa ukvara verechaim v'tanur. A person can lend to her neighbor, a neighbor who is suspected of not keeping Shemitah, right? Even that neighbor, a person can lend her a sifter, a sieve, a hand mill, an oven, right? All things that she might use on Shvi'it produce, on Shemitah produce, which would be a problem. Isn't this lifnei iver, right? Ava lo tavor v'lo titchanima, but you can't sift or grind with her, which is interesting. But I think the question then becomes, why should this be allowed? So what you'd really expect is you'd expect the Mishnah to say, because maybe she'll use it for some proper purpose. But that's not actually what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah actually says the reason you can do it is mipnei derechei shalom. To keep the peace with that other person. What's going on here? Are we saying that in a case of lifnei iver lo titein mechshol, as long as there is something, a need to keep the peace, you're allowed to violate lifnei iver lo titein mechshol, or is something else going on here? So the Tosfot in Gittin, Daf Samach Aleph Amud Aleph, where that Mishnah is quoted, because Gittin is where we have our Darchei Shalom um, uh, uh, discussions. So in Gittin, the Tosfot basically say the Kashel Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam doesn't understand. V'tei Buklei, the reason why it should be allowed for a woman to lend a vessel that can be misused in the Shemitah year to her neighbor, who she knows is bad at keeping Shemitah, right? Or isn't interested in keeping Shemitah, right? The reason why it should have been allowed, v'teibuklei dehavashari, mishum deika lemitle b'tvua shel heter. The reason should have been just like the reason why you're allowed to sell somebody a parachoreshet, a plowing cow in Shemitah, because maybe they'll shecht it. So here too, maybe she'll use it with produce that's not from Shvi'it. Kida'ashkechan b'masechet Shvi'it, Perek Hey, Mishnah Chet. Like we find in the case of being able to sell the parach horeshet in Shemitah. Beit Shammai Amrim lo yimkor lo parach horeshet b'shvit. True, Beit Shammai doesn't approve of it, but Beit Hillel matirin mipnei shechol l'shochta. Beit Hillel allow it because of talinan. We can hang our hats on the fact that they might use it for a totally mutter purpose. So why is the reason not given for a woman lending the pots and pans to somebody who is not a Shemitah keeper? Why is that not the reason given? Why is the reason given because of Darchei Shalom? Omer Rabbeinu Tam says, Dahacha biyadua she'en la ela perot shvi'it. Here, it must be a case where there is no possibility of talinan. There is no mutter permitted use that she could use it for, because this woman only has shvi'it produce in her house. So if you give her a sieve, that's what she's using it for. Hilkach, therefore, ilah mishum darchei shalom hava aser. If not for the fact that this was trying to keep the peace, it would have been prohibited to lend it to her. But uvemecher, when it comes to selling, remember the example was selling a cow that plows in the Shemitah year. Delo shayach darchei shalom. In those situations, it's not about darchei shalom. It's business. So if you don't want to sell to this person, you don't sell to this person. That's very different than somebody who knocks on my door and says, "Can I borrow a pan from you?" My neighbor comes over. If I say no, I might be hurting the relationship. Whereas if somebody says, "I want to buy that cow from you," I can say, "Well, actually, I'm selling it to somebody else," right? Most of the time, no harm, no foul, right? So there, in the case of the sale, it would be usser, right? Because Darchei Shalom doesn't matter. It would be usser if not for the fact limitle in situations where there's no possibility of them using it properly, right? So in other words, in a situation where you sell an animal that can plow to somebody in Shemitah, you better be sure that there's a possibility that they might use it to just eat it, right? If you know that there's no such possibility, then it's usher because of lifnei iver lo titein mechshol. On the other hand, when we're talking about lending to somebody, even if we're sure they're going to misuse it, still because of darchei shalom, there's an allowance here to violate lifnei iver lo titein mechshol. Whoa, that is really bold, right? That's a really bold claim to be able to say that you can violate lifnei iver lo titein mechshol for the purpose of keeping the peace. And I have to tell you, plenty of people disagree with the Balei Tosfot. So, for example, you might say, and this is a bit anachronistic, the Yerushalmi itself on that Mishnah actually says the case where your neighbor comes over and says, "I want to borrow a pot or a pan in the Shemitah year," and I look at them and I say, "Oh, a pot or a pan, I should say a sieve. I keep saying a pot or pan." A place where somebody comes and says, "I want to borrow your sifter," and I know that they don't keep Shemitah. Actually, Rabbi Zira says the only reason I'm allowed to do it is because they can use the sifter for something else. Check it out. Number 4, Rabbi Zira ba kome Rabbi Mana. Okay, so Rabbi Zira asked Rabbi Mana, matnita bistam habe mefurash lo. Are we talking about a situation where the person did not say what they're going to use it for? But if they said, "I'm going to use it to sift my flour," we wouldn't be allowed to lend it to them. Amar le, and so he says, Ustamo lav kiperushohi, lav kiperushohu, right? Says, isn't it the same? Shouldn't it be the same whether the woman said, "I want it for this purpose," that's we know is usher, or whether they didn't? So we say, actually, ani omer, there's a possibility that the napa, what would she use the sieve for? Lispor b'ma'ot, to count her coins. Or kvara, the more fine sifter, lichbor b'chol, maybe she would use it to sift sand. Rechaim, maybe she's asking for a millstone. Litchon basamanim, she's going to use it to grind spices. And a tanur, litmon ba unin shel pishtan, and maybe she'll use her stove to put flax bundles in there, to use it there to store them, right? So really what this Yerushalmi does is it basically says, hey, Mipnei Darchei Shalom is not everything here. Actually, it's a case of Talinan. It's possible that she might use these things for something that's legitimate. And that's what the Chidushei HaRitva actually gloms onto. It says, V'igamanda Amar, Dahachanami Ika Lemitle. There are those who say that here too, in the case of lending the sieve or the sifter or the oven to this person who doesn't keep shvit properly, that there too there's a possibility of we can hang our hats on her using it for something legitimate. Ukedamrinan b'Yerushalmi, like we say in the Yerushalmi, napa livrobra ma'od. She can, look at her coins, specifically each one using the more coarse sifter, kvar livror et hachol, the more discerning sifter, the more delicate sifter she can use for sand, rechaim l'tchon ben samim manim, tanur levashel b'hem onim shel pishtan, all the examples that we just said. V'afilu hachi, and even though talinan, even though there's a possibility, ika lemitle, we could say she could use it for a kosher thing. I lav mishum deika nami mishum darchei shalom lo hitiru. If not for the fact that there's also a darchei shalom issue, there's also a need to keep the peace, we wouldn't have allowed it. V'hatam shari mishum deika lemitle, and it's only allowed in the case where you're lending someone your stuff, because there's a possibility she'll use it for something kosher, and there's a need for shalom, right? And so what about the case where you were able to sell a paracho reshet? Why was that allowed? Because clearly talinan is not enough. Clearly being able to say you might use it for shchita is not good enough. Veneerly, and I think tahatam tama, in the case of being allowed to sell a cow that plows in the Shemitah year, maybe it's because mishum de karavach, right? V'kevan de karavach ve'ika shari, because there a person is actually trying to earn a living, and the combination of you're trying to earn a living, meaning you're trying to sell something and make money, and there's a possibility that they'll use it for the right thing, then maybe that is, that is good enough. But in the case of letting someone borrow something, avagav the ikalamitle, even though there is a possibility that she'll use it for something fine, ilav tamid mishum darchei shalom lo shari. If not for the darchei shalom reason, it wouldn't be allowed. Why? De'amaya v'yatzmali de safek. Because why would you put yourself in this situation of a doubt that they might misuse it, right? It's different if you're trying to make a living, you're trying to, have what you need in order to feed your family, et cetera, right? So that's a very different tune that's being sung here, rather than Darchei Shalom being something that allows you to violate Lifnei Iver Lo Titein Milchol, even if you really know that the other person is going to do something that's not kosher with it. Actually, Darchei Shalom is a secondary reason only when you also have the primary reason that you know they could do something kosher with it. The only reason we're putting ourselves into safek, into doubt that they might do something problematic with it, is because of shalom. Now, I want to add a third piece to this, which is, it's interesting, the Shulchan Aruch in Yoreh De'ah, Kuf Mem Chet, Seif Yud Bet, talks about, or I should say, the Ramah talks about the possibility of Mishum Eva, the worry of hatred of Jews, to come into play in terms of how we might even engage with pagans. The Ramah says, Va'afilu notnim hama'ot lakohanim, you might even give money to their priests on their holiday, right? Blah, blah, blah. Even if you give money to the priests, enosin mehan tikrovet, they don't make use it for a sacrifice, onoi la'elilim, and they don't use it to beautify their idols. El hakohanim ochlim v'shotim bo. They just use it to eat and to drink. So don't worry so much, right, about all of this conversation about being able laseit v'latet imahem biyom chagam, right, to be able to do business, as the first Mishnah in Avodah Zarah was talking about, to be able to do business, right? But then he says, "Va'od eat bazeh mishum eva," right? There's also a possibility that this will cause hatred to Jews if you refuse to do business. If we keep ourselves away from them on their holidays. We live among them. We have to be able to do business with them throughout the year, etc., etc. So there are some people who look at this and they say, oh, well, this is interesting because if we're actually talking about real paganism, right? And we didn't read this, but the Mechaber of the Shulchan Aruch, which comes right before Rav Yosef Karo, actually says, well, maybe today things are different and we don't really understand paganism in the same kind of way. This goes into a whole conversation about the difference between shituf and avodah zarah. That's maybe for another time, but I think we actually should do that because it's Masachet Avodah Zarah. But the point is, some people look at this and they say, whoa, what you just allowed is lifnei iver because you're giving money and maybe it could be used for avodah zarah because we're worried about Ava, we're worried about hatred. Now, I might look at this and say, well, actually, there were two reasons given. One is the money's not really used for paganism. And then two, there's an issue of Ava, kind of similar to what we saw in the Ritva. One is you could use it for a good reason, like for a kosher reason. And two is mipnei derchei shalom. But nonetheless, these are sort of dabbling in this conversation. Okay, so that's kind of example one that I think is interesting to think about on the margins when you're actually interacting not in a hermetic religious environment, but you're interacting with different kinds of people. Do you have to be concerned about Darchei Shalom as you're making these decisions and what are the different shikulim? Now, there's also, by the way, some people who talk about there must be a difference between if it's min haTorah or if it's midrabanan, certainly in terms of mishum eva. But we're not going to get too far into it, but just to keep our thinking big. The second kind of strange case I wanted to bring up is what is known in the Gemara on Daf Yodalet as lifnei de lifnei. Okay? Instead of it being lifnei iver directly, it's lifnei iver de lifnei iver. Let's see the example. Tana umikulan mochurin lahen chavila. All the lists of things in the Mishnah that on Yud Gimel Amud Bet said you can't sell these things to non-Jews. No, you can't sell them as single things, but you could sell them in a bundle. And then it goes, how much is a bundle? Fine. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Why aren't we worried that you're whoever you sell this to, and these are like pagan items, pagan worship items, whoever you sell this to, they're going to sell it to other people. Like I just sold it to them in bulk. Yeah, I get it. They're not going to do it themselves, but they're going to sell it to somebody else as an individual item, and that somebody else is going to give it as a tikrovet for avodah zarah, right? So Amar Abaye says, alifnei mipakdinan, alifnei de lifnei lo mipakdinan. We are commanded not to do lifnei iver, right? The immediate. I can't sell you this strange white chicken or whatever this is because I know that I'm making it more possible for you to do a pagan ritual. But I can sell you this whole big bundle of chickens because you're not going to use it yourself. You're clearly going to sell it, retail. I sell it to you wholesale. You're going to go sell it retail. And I don't have to be worried about that secondary issue of you then doing lifnei iver to somebody else who's going to then give it as a korban, a tikrovet, right? That's the pagan word for korban. Chazal use different words for korban for us and for paganism to keep them distinct in our heads in a very intense way, right? So lifnei de lifnei is so interesting because it kind of feels like it's letting you off the hook, right? It's really, really letting you off the hook. And so here it seems like we don't care about lifnei to lifnei. I'm going to sell these things in bulk to this non-Jew, and this non-Jew is going to sell a retail to another non-Jew, and that non-Jew is going to then use it for a pagan worship. And I don't have a problem, no problem. But then when you look at Avodah Zarah Tedvav Amud Bet, you have a situation with a Jew, and this guy gets interesting. So Rabba Zavin Hahu Chamara L'Yisrael Chashulim Kor Lagoy. Right? Rabba sold a donkey to a particular Jew who generally is suspected of selling livestock to non-Jews, even though they weren't supposed to. Amar le Abaye, so Abaye says, my time oven marhachi. Why did you do that? Amar le, Ana li Yisrael zabine. Right? So he said, what do you mean? What's the problem? I sold it to a Jew. I didn't sell it to a non-Jew. What are you worried about? I'm not allowed to sell the things to a non-Jew. I can sell it to a Jew. Amar le, so he says, yeah, but vaha azul mizabin le. But that Jew is then going to sell it to a non-Jew. So you just did lifnei de lifnei, right? So the answer is Lagoy kamazabin, Yisrael lo kamazabin. The answer was, well, what do you mean? How do you know that that other Jew is going to sell it to a non-Jew? Maybe they'll sell it to a Jew, right? Kind of like talinan. So it's okay. But what's interesting about this Gemara is that if I couldn't give that answer and I knew that the person was going to sell it to a non-Jew and then that non-Jew would use it for paganism, then guess what? I just did lifnei to lifnei and it seems like it was a problem. So how come in one situation, lifnei to lifnei doesn't seem to be a problem? Namely, when I sell something to a non-Jew and they're going to sell it to another non-Jew. And in this case, lifnei to lifnei does seem to be a problem, where I sell it to a Jew who may sell it to a non-Jew, who may sell it to a Jew. So Tosfot basically say, well, it's just clear there's a difference between Jews and non-Jews. We're just stricter about lifnei iver, even in a secondary way when it comes to Jews. We're not as strict when it comes to non-Jews. Now, I think that's interesting because it's then raising the question of, you know, why would you say that non-Jews are responsible not to do Avodah Zarah and not incorporate an Isser of Lifnei Iver L'Tzion Mechshol that they can cause other non-Jews to do Avodah Zarah, right? So this also goes back to the general logic of Lifnei Iver L'Tzion Mechshol. Lifnei Iver L'Tzion Mechshol, another question that we ask is this about doing, it's not just, is this about doing damage to a fellow Jew or to a non-Jew? Is this about having somebody break their covenant with God? It's actually also about, is each mitzvah that we are required to do, is lifnei iver part of that mitzvah? Meaning, I am required to keep Shabbat and I am not allowed to violate Shabbat. And therefore, within that, I am not allowed to commit lifnei iver lo titein mechshol to get somebody else to violate Shabbat. Because if you would say that, then it actually makes no sense to suggest that Jews aren't allowed to violate lifnei iver lo titein mechshol, but non-Jews are. Because if they're not allowed to do paganism, then they're not allowed to get somebody else to do paganism. But if lifnei iver lo titein mechshol is something separate from the mitzvot themselves that we have to observe, then I could see maybe being more machmir, maybe being more severe, that Jews can't even do lifnei to lifnei. Now, I want to end because lifnei to lifnei bothers me a little bit because it's like it's this chain of what's the word? I'm going to call it chain of transmission, but that's not what it is. When we talk about how items are produced and like all of the different steps that items go through from the moment they are, the raw materials are cultivated to when they're put together to when they're packaged, that whole kind of chain. It is true that in halacha, the further away you are from wherever it is on that chain that's problematic, the better. But I also don't want us to give ourselves a pass to say, well, it was indirect, so I don't. So it's interesting to note that the Rambam does not cite the permissibility of selling a bundle of pagan materials to a non-Jew because that's only lifnei to lifnei because they're not going to do avodah zarah, but they're going to just give it to somebody else. He does not cite it, and there are some who want to argue that that is because he does not think it's true. He thinks it is problematic equally lifnei to lifnei for a Jew as for a non-Jew. And so I want to give you an example from a book called The Be'er Yehuda from a 19th century Warsaw Talmid Chacham. And he says as follows. והנה מאי דהיקשו הכסף משנה והלך המשנה, ומאי דהשמיט הרמב"ם ז"ל דין חבילה, דמותר למכור לו. The fact that the Kesef Mishnah and the Lechem Mishnah, both commentaries on the Rambam, say, why did the Rambam leave out the permission given in the Gemara to sell a non-Jew a bundle of things because they're not going to use it for avodah zarah. Sachakol, they might just sell it to somebody else, right? Lefi aniyuti ati says, in my humble opinion, yesh lomar. Here's what I think, right? Yesh lomar ktsat. I guess you could try saying the sover harambam zal. The Rambam holds the Al Korcha Idach Braita the Ketani that actually another Braita, which is Avodah Zarah Taf Ted Vavam Bet, that says the following: Ein mochrin lakutim klei zayin. You shouldn't sell weaponry to kutim. V'chol davar hamazik, or anything that can cause physical damage. Mishum diyim kiru heim la'achirim, because they're going to sell them to other people. Hmm. Well, that's interesting. I can't sell weapons to a non-Jew, not because they're going to use it to murder somebody. And remember, we're talking about the ancient world. The assumption is that they are chashudim al shvichut damim, right? Which is sad that that was actually the assumption that Chazal had to actually feel in real life. It's kind of a sad state of the world, right? But the assumption is, are they actually going to use it themselves to kill somebody? And the Gemara there says, no, they would sell it to somebody else who might kill somebody. Well, one second. You just said to me, I'm allowed to sell the bundle of pagan materials because the person's not going to use it themselves. They're just going to sell it to somebody else. And now we have this Braita that says, I'm not allowed to sell weapons to somebody because they're just going to sell it to somebody else. I thought either you can or you can't. So basically, the Be'er Yehuda, he says, oh, clearly the Rambam holds like this, Braita. That's what he thinks. He thinks actually lifnei to lifnei is a problem. You can't just hide behind, you can't just hide behind the assembly line of, well, I didn't give them the weapon. I just gave the weapon to somebody who gave them the weapon, right? So we don't want you hiding behind that either, right? So one example, the Mishum Eva Mipnei Darchei Shalom, where it's possible that some may be more makil, and one example where people would kind of try to avoid saying that it was their fault at all. This is not Lifnei Eva, it's just Lifnei de Lifnei, where the Be'er Yehuda asserts that maybe the Rambam says, no, 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 no. We're not going to let you get away with that. Thanks, everybody. As always, enjoy the rest of your learning.